Welcome back to my channel, Seekers of Ancient Wisdom. Today, I'm going to reveal something that could potentially save your spiritual well-being and protect you from forces that most people don't even realize exist. We're going to delve into the forbidden pages of one of history's most powerful grimoires, the Book of St. Cyprian. When we talk about cemeteries, most people think only of grief, memories, and paying respects to loved ones. But those who understand the spiritual realm know that cemeteries are powerful nexus points between our world and the realm of the dead. The veil between worlds is exceptionally thin in these sacred grounds. But who was Saint Cyprian, and why should we heed his warnings? Before becoming a devoted Christian bishop and eventually a saint, Cyprian was one of the most powerful sorcerers of the ancient world. He studied dark arts in the mystic centers of Egypt, Chaldea, and India before his conversion. This unique background makes his grimoire invaluable. It contains knowledge from someone who understood both sides of the spiritual realm. The Book of St. Cyprian has been feared and respected for centuries. It contains rituals, warnings, and knowledge that many spiritual authorities have tried to suppress. Today, I'm sharing with you 5 critical errors that St. Cyprian explicitly warns against in his writings. Errors that countless people make every day without realizing the spiritual danger they're putting themselves in. What makes these warnings so important is that they apply to everyone, regardless of your spiritual beliefs. The energetic laws that govern these interactions work whether you believe in them or not, just as gravity affects everyone regardless of their understanding of physics. Each time you visit a cemetery or attend a funeral, you enter a space charged with intense emotions, spiritual energy, and the presence of the dead. Most people walk into these spaces completely unprotected, unknowingly opening themselves to attachments, energy drains, and spiritual interference that can follow them home and affect every aspect of their lives. I've received hundreds of messages from followers describing unexplained illnesses, financial problems, relationship issues, and persistent nightmares that began after cemetery visits. Many had no idea their cemetery behavior was the source of their problems until discovering these ancient warnings. The knowledge I'm about to share has been kept from the general public, preserved only in obscure texts and oral traditions passed down through generations of those who work with the spiritual realm. St. Cyprian's warnings are especially powerful because they come from someone who once commanded dark forces before choosing to protect people from them. What you learn today could explain problems you've been experiencing for years without understanding their source. More importantly, I'll share the exact protection methods that St. Cyprian himself recommended, methods that have been tested and proven effective across centuries. Pay close attention, because what I'm about to reveal might sound simple, but ignoring these warnings can open doors to spiritual influences that are incredibly difficult to remove once they've attached to you or your home. Let's begin with the first and perhaps most dangerous error people make in cemeteries. The first critical error St. Cyprian warns against is picking up or collecting any object found in a cemetery, whether it's coins, stones, jewelry, toys, or anything else you might find on the ground or near graves. This warning is so important that it appears multiple times throughout his grimoire. According to St. Cyprian's teachings, every object that resides within cemetery grounds gradually becomes what he calls an anchor point for the energies that permeate these sacred spaces. In spiritual terms, these objects absorb and store the grief, pain, and spiritual residue of the dead and mourners alike. They become energetically coded to the cemetery's specific vibration. When you remove one of these objects, you're not just taking a physical item. You're creating what St. Cyprian describes as an etheric bridge between the cemetery and your personal space. This bridge allows energies and sometimes entities to travel directly into your home, following the object you've taken. Think of it like this. In the spiritual realm, these objects act as GPS trackers, creating a direct connection between the world of the dead and your personal space. The energies follow the familiar resonance of the object, drawn to it like a beacon. St. Cyprian specifically mentions coins as particularly dangerous items to collect. In many magical traditions, coins left at grave sites are spiritual payments or offerings. By taking these, you're essentially intercepting a spiritual transaction, creating what he calls a debt to the dead that will inevitably be collected. The consequences of this error can manifest in numerous ways. Many people report experiencing sudden financial difficulties after taking coins from cemeteries, jobs lost, unexpected expenses, or persistent money problems that seem to have no rational cause. St. Cyprian explains this as the direct result of interrupting energetic exchanges meant for the deceased. Other common symptoms include unexplained fatigue, as these energies often drain the life force of those they attach to. Persistent nightmares featuring unfamiliar people or places are another warning sign. These are often communications from the entities that have followed the object into your home. More serious cases involve what St. Cyprian calls full attachments, where an entity actually begins influencing thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. People with these attachments often experience personality changes, sudden mood swings, or thoughts that feel foreign and intrusive. What makes this even more dangerous is that dark practitioners know this spiritual principle well and exploit it. St. Cyprian warns that those practicing harmful magic intentionally leave enchanted objects in cemeteries, knowing that innocent people might pick them up. These objects are specifically designed to create attachments or bring misfortune to whoever takes them. I received a message last month from a follower named Michael who had been experiencing severe insomnia and anxiety for over a year. During a consultation, he mentioned picking up a strange coin with unusual markings from his grandfather's gravesite, thinking it was left by a family member. After following the purification ritual I'll share later, his symptoms disappeared within days. The coin, when properly examined, contained symbols associated with binding spells. Another crucial point St. Cyprian emphasizes is that intention doesn't matter in these cases. Even if you take an object with innocent or even respectful intentions, perhaps as a memento of a loved one, the spiritual laws still apply. The energetic connection is created regardless of why you took the object. Remember this fundamental principle from St. Cyprian's teachings. What belongs to the realm of the dead must remain in the realm of the dead. The boundary between these worlds exists for our protection, and disturbing these boundaries has consequences. Now, let's move on to the second grave error that St. Cyprian warns against, one that's become increasingly common in our modern age of smartphones and social media. The second critical error St. Cyprian warns against might surprise you, especially in our modern era where documenting everything has become second nature. This error is photographing tombstones, graves, or any funerary monuments. While St. Cyprian lived long before the invention of photography, his grimoire contains warnings about creating images or likenesses of tomb markings. The spiritual principle behind this warning applies perfectly to modern photography, perhaps even more powerfully than the drawings or etchings of his time. According to St. Cyprian's teachings, tombstones and grave markers serve as what he called anchoring points for the deceased's spiritual energy. These markers don't just identify the physical remains, they create a spiritual focal point where the energy of the departed can be honored and contained. When you photograph these markers, you're creating what St. Cyprian termed an essence duplicate, a copy that carries the energetic signature of the original. The camera, far from being just a mechanical device, acts as what St. Cyprian would call a spirit trap, capturing more than just the physical appearance of the tombstone. In spiritual terms, photographs create a thin but persistent connection between the subject and the image. When that subject is already a powerful spiritual conductor, like a grave marker, the photograph becomes what he described as a doorway in miniature. This connection works both ways. Not only are you capturing something of the grave's essence, but you're also creating a pathway through which the energies associated with that grave can locate and follow you. Saint Cyprian described this as giving directions to wandering spirits. The consequences of this error often manifest more subtly than some others. People who keep cemetery photographs frequently report experiencing unusual dreams about unfamiliar places or people. These are often unconscious connections to the energies linked to the photographed locations. Sensations of being watched, unexplained cold spots in the home, or electronic devices malfunctioning are also common signs of these spiritual intrusions. More concerning are cases where people experience repetitive bad luck or situations that seem to mirror the circumstances of the deceased person whose grave they photographed. Saint Cyprian warned about this phenomenon, explaining that energies tend to recreate familiar patterns. By creating a link to a deceased person's marker, you may inadvertently invite similar circumstances into your own life. This warning extends beyond just photographing individual graves. General cemetery photographs, especially those taken during funerals or at spiritually charged times like dusk or dawn, can capture what St. Cyprian called mass emanations, the collective energy of multiple spirits or emotional imprints. The risk increases significantly when these photographs are shared on social media or displayed prominently in homes. According to St. Cyprian's principles, each viewing of the image strengthens the connection, and digital sharing creates multiple access points for these energies to affect not just you, but anyone who views the image. I once worked with a client who had developed severe, unexplained anxiety that began shortly after she created a photography project documenting historic cemeteries. She had been experiencing nightmares featuring people in vintage clothing and persistent feelings of being followed. After removing all the cemetery photographs from her home and digital devices, followed by a thorough spiritual cleansing, her symptoms subsided within weeks. St. Cyprian particularly warns against photographing fresh graves or those belonging to people who died under traumatic circumstances. These graves carry especially potent energetic charges that can more easily transfer through photographic connections. For those researching family history or documenting historical sites, St. Cyprian's grimoire does offer alternative approaches that I'll share in our solutions section. The key understanding here is that creating permanent images of these powerful spiritual anchors establishes connections that remain active as long as the image exists. Let's continue to the third critical error, one that many people commit without realizing its profound spiritual implications. The third grave error. St. Cyprian warns about concerns something most people never consider. The clothes you wear to a cemetery or funeral and what you do with them afterward. This error involves not properly cleansing or handling the clothing worn during cemetery visits. According to St. Cyprian's teachings, fabric, especially natural fibers, functions as what he called a second skin in the spiritual realm. Clothing absorbs and retains energetic imprints from surroundings with remarkable efficiency. His grimoire specifically notes that garments act as sponges of the invisible, collecting residual energies, emotional imprints, and even spiritual attachments from environments charged with strong energies. Cemeteries, being powerful convergence points between the worlds of the living and dead, saturate anything within their boundaries with what St. Cyprian termed death miasma, a subtle energetic field that clings especially well to cloth, hair, and porous materials. This invisible contamination doesn't simply dissipate once you leave the cemetery grounds. When you return home, wearing these energetically charged clothes, and continue about your day, sitting on furniture, interacting with family members, or sleeping in your bed while still wearing or without cleansing these garments, you're essentially transplanting cemetery energies into your personal space. Saint Cyprian described this process as seeding your sanctuary with foreign spirits. The consequences of this error often begin subtly. Initial symptoms might include unexplained fatigue, as these foreign energies draw life force from their surroundings to sustain themselves. Disturbed sleep, particularly involving dreams about unknown people or being lost in unfamiliar locations, is another common indicator. Saint Cyprian noted that these dreams often represent spiritual entities trying to communicate or orient themselves in their new environment. As the contamination spreads through your home, more concerning manifestations may develop. Family members might experience sudden mood changes or unexplained conflicts. Pets, being naturally more sensitive to spiritual energies, often react by avoiding certain areas where contaminated clothing has been placed, or by staring at empty spaces as if tracking invisible movements. More severe cases can develop into what Saint Cyprian called dwelling sickness, a state where the entire home becomes spiritually compromised. Signs include persistent illness that improves when away from home, electronic malfunctions, unexplained sounds, or objects being moved or misplaced. The risk increases significantly if cemetery-contaminated clothing is mixed with other garments without proper cleansing. Saint Cyprian warned that this creates a contagion effect, where the energetic imprint can transfer to other clothing items, essentially multiplying the contamination. Black clothing, which is commonly worn at funerals, poses a particular risk. According to Saint Cyprian's color theory, black acts as an energetic absorber, collecting and concentrating ambient energies rather than reflecting them. His grimoire specifically cautions that the mourner's black becomes a vessel for sorrow and attachment, making dark funeral attire especially prone to carrying heavy energetic burdens back into the home. I worked with a family last year who had been experiencing persistent health issues and relationship tensions that began shortly after attending a funeral. During our consultation, I learned that the funeral clothes had been casually tossed into the regular laundry and washed with everyday garments. Following the cleansing protocols I'll share later and properly handling the contaminated clothing, their home environment improved dramatically within days. Saint Cyprian emphasizes that this form of contamination occurs regardless of your spiritual beliefs or awareness. Just as you would wash your hands after visiting a hospital to prevent physical contagion, spiritual hygiene requires specific practices to prevent energetic contamination from cemetery visits. The grimoire mentions that this principle extends beyond just clothing to include accessories, jewelry, and even vehicles used to travel to cemeteries. Each can become what Saint Cyprian called carriers of the veil, transporting subtle energetic influences across the boundary between sacred and personal spaces. As we'll see in the solutions section, Saint Cyprian provides specific rituals for cleansing garments that have been exposed to cemetery energies. These methods go beyond physical washing to address the spiritual imprints that conventional cleaning cannot remove. Now, let's move on to the fourth error, one that involves common items that most people would never suspect could become spiritually compromised. The fourth critical error St. Cyprian warns against involves the use of cleaning tools and objects at cemeteries or funerals and then bringing them back into your home. This includes brooms, brushes, cloths, buckets, and any other items used to clean or maintain grave sites. St. Cyprian's grimoire contains multiple references to what he calls tools of transition, objects that, by their very nature and purpose, are designed to move, transfer, or transform energies and materials. Cleaning implements fall squarely into this category. In spiritual terms, these objects don't just physically clean, they energetically gather and redistribute. According to St. Cyprian, when these tools are used in spiritually charged locations like cemeteries, they become what he termed collectors of the unseen. The broom that sweeps around a grave doesn't just gather physical debris, it accumulates layers of spiritual residue, emotional imprints, and sometimes even conscious entities that are drawn to its movement and purpose. The grimoire specifically mentions brooms as particularly potent collectors, noting that in many magical traditions worldwide, brooms are recognized as having inherent spiritual properties related to boundaries, thresholds, and the movement of energies. When used in a cemetery, a broom becomes what Saint Cyprian called a spirit rake, gathering invisible energies just as effectively as it collects visible leaves or dirt. The danger comes when these spiritually charged implements are then brought back into the home and used for ordinary cleaning purposes. Then Cyprian describes this as spreading the seed of disturbance, as these tools literally redistribute cemetery energies throughout your living space with each use. The consequences often manifest as a gradual but persistent decline in the home's atmosphere and the well-being of its inhabitants. Financial difficulties are frequently reported, which Saint Cyprian attributes to what he called poverty spirits, entities that create blocks to abundance and material security. These are especially attracted to cleaning implements due to their association with removal and disposal. Other common manifestations include increasing discord among family members, small accidents or minor injuries that occur with unusual frequency, or a general sense that the home never feels truly clean despite regular maintenance. In more severe cases, people report hearing sweeping or cleaning sounds when no one is performing these activities, a phenomenon St. Cyprian attributed to entities continuing to use the spiritual imprints of these tools. The risk is compounded when water is involved. As in mops, buckets, or cloths used with liquid, St. Cyprian identified water as a powerful spirit conductor that absorbs and transmits spiritual energies with exceptional efficiency. Tools used with water in cemetery settings become doubly charged, containing both the energies they've swept up and those absorbed through the water itself. I once consulted with a woman who had been experiencing escalating financial problems and unexplained tensions in her marriage. During our discussion, she mentioned that she regularly cleaned her mother's grave and would bring the same broom and bucket back home for regular use. After properly disposing of these items and performing the cleansing rituals I'll share later, her situation improved dramatically within a month. St. Cyprian is explicit in his directive. Tools used for cemetery maintenance should never cross the threshold of your home. His grimoire states, "Let what serves the dead not serve the living, lest it bring the concerns of one world into the other." This principle applies even to seemingly innocent items, like gardening tools used to maintain grave sites. For those who regularly maintain family graves, St. Cyprian offers specific guidance on how to properly dedicate tools exclusively for cemetery use, and how to store them appropriately. Information I'll share in our solutions section. Now, let's explore the fifth and final error, one that involves something most people consider beautiful and harmless, but which St. Cyprian identified as potentially one of the most direct conduits between the world of the dead and the living. The fifth critical error St. Cyprian warns against involves flowers, specifically touching, handling, or removing flowers from graves, funerals, or anywhere within cemetery grounds. This might seem like an innocent or even respectful act, but according to St. Cyprian's teachings, it carries profound spiritual risks. In his grimoire, St. Cyprian devotes significant attention to the spiritual properties of flowers, describing them as vessels of life essence that serve specific functions in the boundary between worlds. Cemetery flowers are not merely decorative, they fulfill what he called a transitional purpose, helping to ease the passage of souls and serving as conduits for prayers and intentions directed to the deceased. When flowers are placed on graves or used in funeral settings, they undergo what St. Cyprian termed an energetic conversion. Their natural life essence becomes intertwined with the spiritual energies of death and transition. They essentially become what he described as spirit food, energetic offerings that nourish and sustain the connection between the living and the dead. By removing these flowers from their intended location, you're interrupting a spiritual exchange. St. Cyprian's writings warn that this creates what he called an unfulfilled offering, a spiritual debt that will seek completion. More concerning, the flowers themselves become what he described as tethers, physical objects that maintain a direct energetic connection to the grave or deceased person they were intended for. When these flowers are brought into a home, they create what St. Cyprian called a spirit bridge, a direct pathway through which the energies of the cemetery and potentially the consciousness of the deceased can enter your personal space. This connection remains active as long as any part of the flower, even dried petals or a single leaf, remains in your possession. The consequences of this error often manifest as a sense of lingering presence in the home, a feeling that you're not alone even when you physically are. Many people report unusual cold spots, subtle sounds without source, or objects that seem to move or disappear without explanation. These are what St. Cyprian identified as common signs of a spirit bridge being established. More severe manifestations can include dreams featuring the deceased person whose grave the flowers came from, even if you never knew them personally. St. Cyprian explained this as the spirit attempting to communicate across the bridge you've inadvertently created. Some people experience sudden, unexplained emotional states, particularly sadness or nostalgia for people or places they have no connection to in their waking life. The risk is heightened with certain types of flowers. St. Cyprian specifically mentions lilies, roses, and chrysanthemums as having especially potent spiritual properties in cemetery contexts. These flowers, commonly used in funeral arrangements, are particularly effective spirit conductors due to their symbolic associations with death, transition, and remembrance across multiple cultural traditions. Even more dangerous is the practice of creating keepsakes from cemetery flowers, such as pressing them in books or creating dried arrangements. St. Cyprian warns that these preserved remains become permanent spirit anchors, maintaining their connections indefinitely unless properly cleansed or disposed of through specific spiritual protocols. I once worked with a client who had been experiencing persistent nightmares featuring an elderly woman she didn't recognize. During our consultation, she mentioned keeping a pressed rose from her grandfather's funeral in her journal. When we explored further, she realized the nightmares had begun shortly after preserving this flower. After properly disposing of the rose using St. Cyprian's methods, her nightmares ceased completely. St. Cyprian's grimoire emphasizes that this warning applies even to flowers from your own family members' graves. While the intention may be one of remembrance and love, the spiritual mechanics remain the same. His writings state, "Love may guide the hand that takes the bloom, but the laws of spirit are not swayed by mortal intention." For those who wish to honor deceased loved ones with flowers, St. Cyprian offers alternative approaches that avoid creating these spiritual connections, methods I'll share in our solutions section. Now that we've covered the 5 critical errors, let's explore the protective measures and solutions that St. Cyprian's grimoire provides for those who must visit cemeteries or attend funerals. Now that we understand the spiritual risks, let's explore the first set of protection methods that St. Cyprian's grimoire provides for cemetery visits. These protection techniques focus on creating what he calls a spiritual shield before you even enter cemetery grounds. According to St. Cyprian, the most powerful form of protection is a properly consecrated amulet or talisman worn on the body. His grimoire specifically recommends silver as the ideal material, describing it as the moon's metal that repels the shadows. A St. Cyprian medal, properly blessed, creates what he called a boundary of light around the wearer. The consecration process is crucial. An unconsecrated medal functions merely as jewelry without spiritual potency. St. Cyprian provides a specific blessing ritual. The medal should be cleansed first in salt water, mixed with a few drops of holy water. Then pass through the smoke of white sage or frankincense while reciting the prayer of Saint Cyprian for protection, which begins, "Through the power that converted Cyprian from darkness to light, I consecrate this medal as my shield against all spiritual harm." For those without access to a proper silver medal, Saint Cyprian offers several alternative protections. One of the most accessible is the garlic clove amulet, which he describes as a natural ward against hungry spirits. The preparation is simple, but must be precise. Select a firm garlic clove, carve a small cross on its surface, and wrap it in a square of white natural cloth. This should be tied with 3 knots while speaking the intention. As this knot is tied, so my spirit is sealed against intrusion. This garlic amulet should be worn at the center of the chest, closest to the heart chakra, which St. Cyprian identified as the primary entry point for spiritual attachments. The grimoire specifies that this protection must be disposed of immediately after leaving the cemetery. Never bring it into your home. The proper disposal method involves leaving it at a crossroads or running water source, while saying, "Your purpose is fulfilled. Return to the earth." For additional protection, St. Cyprian recommends carrying a small amount of sea salt in a pocket or pouch. His grimoire describes salt as the great purifier that no spirit of harm may cross. Before entering cemetery grounds, take a pinch of this salt and trace a small cross on your forehead while mentally establishing your protective intention. Perhaps most importantly, St. Cyprian emphasizes the power of conscious spiritual boundaries. Before entering a cemetery, he instructs that you should pause at the entrance and clearly state your intention. "I enter with respect, but remain separate. I bring only my presence, and will take away nothing but my own memories." This verbal declaration establishes what he called a contract of separation that spiritually conscious entities will recognize and respect. The grimoire also provides a specific prayer for cemetery protection that should be recited upon entering. "By the power that redeemed Cyprian, I walk protected. What belongs to this place stays in this place. I am but a visitor who will depart unburdened and unbound." This establishes what St. Cyprian called a spiritual passport, a clear designation of your temporary status in this realm. For those who are particularly sensitive to spiritual energies or who have experienced problems after cemetery visits in the past, St. Cyprian recommends visualizing what he termed a light cocoon, a shell of protective white or golden light surrounding your entire body. His instructions specify that this visualization should include seeing this light as completely sealed, with no gaps or openings through which external energies could enter. These protection methods should be employed before every cemetery visit, regardless of duration. As St. Cyprian warns, the veil between worlds does not measure time as mortals do. A moment's exposure is sufficient for attachment to occur. Now, let's explore the second solution, the purification rituals that St. Cyprian prescribes for after-cemetery visits. Once you've left the cemetery, St. Cyprian teaches that immediate spiritual cleansing is essential to remove any subtle energetic attachments or influences that may have connected to you despite protective measures. His grimoire provides several powerful purification methods specifically designed for post-cemetery cleansing. The most comprehensive of these is what St. Cyprian calls the 7 herbs bath, a ritual cleansing that addresses both physical and spiritual contamination. According to his writings, this bath dissolves the threads that spirits may have attached during your cemetery visit. To prepare this purification bath, you'll need to gather 7 specific herbs that St. Cyprian identifies as having powerful spiritual cleansing properties. Rue, rosemary, basil, bay leaf, hyssop, sage, and thyme. Each herb serves a specific function in the spiritual cleansing process. For example, rue cuts energetic cords, rosemary creates boundaries, and sage clears negative imprints. The preparation must follow St. Cyprian's precise instructions. Boil a handful of each herb in a large pot of water for 7 minutes while reciting the Psalm of Purification, Psalm 51. Remove from heat and allow to cool until comfortable for bathing. Strain the liquid and add it to your bathwater. For maximum effectiveness, St. Cyprian specifies that this bath should be taken before sunset on the same day as your cemetery visit. As you immerse yourself in this herbal bath, St. Cyprian instructs you to recite, "As water cleanses the body, let these herbs cleanse my spirit. What clung to me at the threshold of death be now dissolved and returned to its proper realm." Visualize the water drawing out any dark or heavy energies from your body and aura, transforming them into light as they dissolve into the bath water. After bathing, allow your body to air dry if possible, rather than using a towel, which St. Cyprian says can wipe the purification back onto the skin. The used bathwater should be disposed of by pouring it at a crossroads or into running water, never down household drains, while saying, "Return to the elements, carrying nothing of me with you." For those who cannot prepare the full herbal bath, St. Cyprian offers an alternative emergency cleansing using just lemon and salt. Cut a lemon in half and coat the cut surface with sea salt. Use this to rub down your body from head to feet in a downward motion, focusing especially on the back of the neck, chest, and joints, which St. Cyprian identifies as common attachment points for spiritual influences. While performing this cleansing, recite "Salt of protection, fruit of purification, cleanse my body and spirit of all that does not serve my highest good." This lemon salt cleanser should then be taken far from your home and buried in the earth. Another powerful purification method from St. Cyprian's grimoire is smoke cleansing with specific resins. He particularly recommends frankincense and myrrh, which he describes as the purifiers that stand at the threshold between worlds. These sacred resins have been used for millennia in spiritual purification practices across multiple traditions. To perform this cleansing, burn these resins on a charcoal disc and thoroughly smoke your body from head to foot, allowing the sacred smoke to penetrate your clothing. St. Cyprian instructs that you should then change into fresh clothes that have never been worn to a cemetery, sealing the purification process. The grimoire emphasizes that timing is crucial for these purification rituals. They should ideally be performed within hours of leaving the cemetery, as what St. Cyprian calls the window of attachment remains open for approximately 1 solar cycle, day after exposure. The longer purification is delayed, the more difficult it becomes to fully remove subtle spiritual influences. Now, let's examine the third solution, which addresses one of the most common sources of cemetery contamination: clothing and proper attire. The final protection method from St. Cyprian's grimoire focuses on clothing, both what to wear during cemetery visits and how to handle these garments afterward. This solution addresses one of the most common ways that cemetery energies enter homes and affect residents. According to St. Cyprian, the color of clothing worn to cemeteries has profound spiritual significance. His writings specifically recommend white as the most protective color, describing it as the color that reflects all energies rather than absorbing them. White garments create what he called a light barrier that makes it more difficult for heavy or negative energies to attach to your energetic field. If white clothing isn't practical, then Cyprian suggests purple, particularly lavender shades, as an alternative protective color. In his color theory, purple represents spiritual awareness and protection, creating what he termed a frequency of higher vibration that naturally repels lower energetic influences. Blue is listed as a third option, particularly for those who are naturally sensitive or empathic, as it strengthens personal energetic boundaries. The grimoire explicitly warns against wearing black to cemeteries whenever possible, despite its traditional association with mourning in Western cultures. St. Cyprian explains that black absorbs all energetic frequencies, including the heavy emanations of grief and spiritual activity, present in cemeteries. These absorbed energies can then transfer directly to the wearer's energy field. Beyond color, St. Cyprian provides guidance on fabric choices. Natural fibers like cotton, linen, and silk are recommended as they breathe energetically and are easier to cleanse afterward. He specifically advises against synthetic materials, which can develop what he called energetic static that attracts and holds spiritual impressions. For additional protection, St. Cyprian suggests incorporating subtle protective symbols into your cemetery attire. These can be small and discreet. A simple cross stitched inside a collar or cuff, or protective symbols drawn in blessed oil on the inside of clothing. These create what he described as seals of passage that clearly mark you as a visitor rather than a resident of the spiritual boundary zone that cemeteries represent. The grimoire provides a specific prayer to be recited while dressing for cemetery visits. I clothe myself not just in fabric but in light. These garments serve as boundary between worlds, allowing me to visit with respect while remaining separate and whole. This consecrates the clothing as protective gear rather than ordinary attire. However, the most crucial aspect of St. Cyprian's clothing protocol concerns what to do with these garments after leaving the cemetery. His instructions are explicit. Cemetery clothes should never enter your main living spaces while still carrying cemetery energies. Ideally, these garments should be removed in a transitional space like a garage, mudroom, or bathroom immediately upon returning home. St. Cyprian instructs that they should then be submerged in salt water, 1 tablespoon of sea salt per gallon, for at least 1 hour before regular washing. While preparing this salt bath, recite, "Salt of the earth, water of life." Cleanse these fabrics of all impressions and influences gathered beyond the boundaries of the living. For those without the ability to soak clothes immediately, St. Cyprian offers an alternative method. The garments should be turned inside out and sprinkled with protective herbs, rosemary, basil, or sage, while reciting a prayer of cleansing. They should then be stored in a separate bag or container away from other clothing until proper cleansing can be performed. The grimoire specifically warns against allowing cemetery clothes to come into contact with bedding, as beds are where we are most spiritually vulnerable during sleep states. It also advises against washing cemetery clothes with everyday garments, as the energetic impressions can transfer during washing. St. Cyprian recommends maintaining a specific set of cemetery clothes that are used exclusively for this purpose and stored separately from everyday attire. This creates what he called a designated vessel for these energetic exposures, containing them to specific garments rather than spreading them throughout your wardrobe. By following these clothing protocols, you create what St. Cyprian described as a sealed system that prevents cemetery energies from infiltrating your home and personal space through one of their most common vectors. We've now explored the 5 critical errors to avoid during cemetery visits and the 3 powerful protection methods from St. Cyprian's grimoire. This ancient wisdom has protected spiritual workers, priests, and ordinary people for centuries. And today, it can protect you and your loved ones from unwitting spiritual exposure. Remember that cemeteries are sacred boundary spaces, neither fully in our world nor fully in the next. When we enter these grounds, we step into what St. Cyprian called a thin place, where the usual spiritual laws and protections are naturally diminished. Without proper knowledge and protection, we can inadvertently bring home influences that were never meant to cross that threshold. The wisdom in St. Cyprian's grimoire wasn't recorded to create fear, but to empower those who must interact with these powerful spaces. By understanding and respecting these spiritual boundaries, you can visit loved ones' graves, attend funerals, and honor the dead while remaining spiritually protected and whole. I encourage you to implement these protective practices the very next time you visit a cemetery or funeral. Many followers have reported immediate improvements in their home atmosphere, sleep quality, and overall well-being after adopting these ancient protocols. If you've been experiencing unexplained difficulties, persistent bad dreams, or unusual occurrences in your home after cemetery visits, the purification methods we've discussed can help clear these influences even after they've established themselves. The boundary between worlds requires respect and knowledge to navigate safely. As Saint Cyprian himself wrote in the closing of his section on cemetery interactions, the wise traveler does not fear the journey between realms, for with proper preparation, one may walk among shadows while remaining firmly in the light. May the protective wisdom of Saint Cyprian guide and shield you in all your journeys between worlds. Remember that knowledge is your greatest protection, and by honoring these ancient boundaries, you honor both the living and the dead. If you found value in these sacred teachings from the Book of Saint Cyprian, please support this channel by liking this video, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell. Your support allows me to continue sharing this protected wisdom that many would prefer to remain hidden. In our next video, I'll be revealing Saint Cyprian's 3 most powerful protection rituals for cleansing homes that already have spiritual attachments or negative energies. Until then, walk in light and protection,